It is brilliant to be back at the JLF, and I just want to thank Sanjoy and William and Namita for curating this amazing cultural explosion. And actually, I should say, the last time Marcus and I did a JLF event together, Marcus had, and I'm not joking, had a plastic brain stuck on his head. He was gyrating to Jai Ho in the Maldives, and during a kind of a flash mob dance.
I'm never going to be able to live this down. It's now my calling card. It seems I have to do a Bollywood dance for you with the rhythm of prime numbers or something.
And I mean, it's a kind of testament to what a Renaissance man Marcus is, does plays, and is a brilliant mathematics popularizer, and that's why we're here today to celebrate. And if I can remember when the music of the primes first came out, I was a science editor of the Telegraph, and the first thing, I think our first big interaction, we might have met before then, was you writing me a piece about prime numbers and football shirts, I seem to remember.
That's right. It wasn't our first interaction because as a very junior kind of scientist experimenting with communicating in newspapers, I actually phoned Roger up with an idea I thought I had for a really good news story in the Telegraph. This is about 1996 or something.
Crikey.
And I pitched the idea because Roger is just somehow... was such an important person for us. I just want to pay testament
Steady
to Roger.
on.
No, for a scientist trying to communicate stories through the newspaper, Roger was the man to go to, and the man who helped us, many of us, to actually do our first stories.
Remember, Marcus, I made you, I can break you. Okay?
Exactly. Well, actually, so the interesting thing is I learned a lot from this first interaction because Roger, I phoned him up and I was a bit terrified because he was already such a big name in science journalism, and he said, Marcus, that isn't a story. I'm sorry, there's no time to it. It's not. Why should I publish it today? And he turned it down. But I learned a lot from that. And so the next time I pitched it, I thought, right, I have to really put an interesting package together. And it actually grew out of. I brought the very first edition of Music of the Primes, which was published 20 years ago, and my publisher let me choose my favourite primes to put on the front cover of the book. So I lived at number 53, Queen Elizabeth Walk, up in Hackney. So I got my front door. That's my front door on the front cover. I live in Stoke Newington, so my local bus, which I got brought down here, is the number 73 bus. I only take prime number buses. The others are rubbish. And I'm also an Arsenal supporter. And we just...
Boo! Sorry, I prefer Tottenham.
Do we have any Spurs supporters here? Oh my gosh, Roger, it's a little secret you've been keeping.
Marcus, it's the end of a beautiful relationship.
It is, yes. Anyway, we just stolen their best player, Sol Campbell, who'd gone from Spurs to Arsenal, and he played in the number 23 shirt for Arsenal. So to rub it into all my Spurs mates, I put the 23 Arsenal shirt on the front cover of this book. But it was an amazing coincidence that David Beckham moved from Man United to Real Madrid at the same time as this book came out. I mean, I couldn't have asked for a better publicity stunt, because what number shirt did he play in Real Madrid? Number 23. So everyone saw this story about Beckham moving to Real Madrid and this book coming out with 23 football shirt on the front. And I was inundated with people trying to explain, okay, so why did he choose 23? I was on TalkSport Radio explaining, why did Beckham choose 23? And eventually I came up with such a theory.
Was he working on, the something hypothesis?
No, but the really weird thing is that slightly later on Real Madrid website, there was David Beckham explaining maths to kids. So he is a hidden mathematician, I think. But anyway, I had to come up with a theory. So, and when I looked at Real, and so this is the story I pitched to Roger, which we actually eventually published in the Telegraph, was the explanation about why Beckham had chosen 23. Because 23 is one of these indivisible numbers, these prime numbers at 23. When I looked at Real Madrid's football team, all the key players, the Galacticos, they were all playing in prime number shirts. There was Carlos at the time in number 3, Zidane number 5, Raul number 7, Ronaldo number 11, Beckham 23. So he was clearly a key building block, and this is the point about prime numbers, they build all other numbers. They're the atoms of our subject. So I realized, so they've got a mathematician on the board at Real Madrid, and every time a Galacticos comes in, they give him a prime number shirt. And I actually play football for a team up on the Hackney Marshes. I play in the number 17 shirt, a prime. But most of my other team members are playing in rubbish numbers like 8 and 15 and divisible 9. And we become second, we become bottom of our league. We play in the League Division 2. And my team were very depressed. And I said, I've got an idea. Why don't we change our kit? And we'll all play in prime numbers. You know, it's worked for Beckham and Real Madrid. So we got a new kit. We used to have a kind of Roma-looking kit. We now have one which looks a bit like Watford. And we all play in prime number shirts. 2, 3, 5, I'm in 17, all the way up to 43. And it transformed our season.
Yeah, I wonder, Marcus...
No, we got promoted. So primes are really important to football.
For perhaps those who are not mathematically literate, you probably should give the official prime definition. So
yes. So here's me burbling on about primes, and I haven't told you what they are.
Yeah, exactly.
So a prime number is a number which is indivisible. You can't pull it apart into two other numbers multiplied together. So 15 is not prime because you can divide it into 3 times 5. But 3 and 5 are, you can't break those apart. They're indivisible. So. And this is a lovely thing. Every number, 105, for example, well, that's clearly divisible by 5. Then you get down to 21 times 5. That's 3 times 7 times 5. But then you get down to the indivisible things. So for me, these prime numbers, these indivisible numbers, are a little bit like the hydrogen and oxygen of the world of mathematics. They are the atoms from which you can build all other numbers. So, you know, in chemistry, probably the most important thing on every lab wall is the periodic table, which lists all of the atoms from which we can build molecules. So for mathematicians, our periodic table is a list of these prime numbers.
Yeah.
Now chemists, they have it easy because there's only like 109 stable chemical atoms. But one of the first great theorems that was proved 2,000 years ago is that there are infinitely many of these indivisible numbers. So we can't write them out in a table. We can't resort to some database because they just go on forever. So we're faced with trying to find some other kind of explanation for are there any patterns there?
Yeah.
And this is a great thing. Mendeleev discovered this wonderful pattern in the periodic table, this kind of rule of 8s. And that's what the period is in the periodic table. And it allowed him and other scientists to predict new particle atoms that were missing in this pattern. So Mendeleev's great breakthrough was understanding a pattern, a period, kind of, which helped discover new atoms. So for us, this is the challenge, and this is kind of the story of the book, is for 2,000 years, we've been trying to understand, okay, these numbers, they look a little bit random, and it's really hard to predict where the next one will be. Is there a pattern? Yeah. Is there a formula? Is there some rule, a bit like the Fibonacci numbers? Some of you may know the Fibonacci numbers. These are numbers which go 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. And there's a pattern because you get the next number by adding the two previous numbers together. So 8 plus 13 is 21. So we were sort of looking, is there a pattern to these prime numbers? And we just couldn't find one. Let me just say, since we're at the JLF, these numbers, the Fibonacci numbers, has anybody heard of these numbers? Fibonacci numbers, yeah, they're very popular, and they occur in nature, and this is where Fibonacci numbers. They should not be called the Fibonacci numbers. They were not discovered first by Fibonacci. They were discovered first by Indian musicians and poets who were interested in the rhythms that you could make with long and short beats. We've just been listening, Roger and I, to the wonderful morning music. Fibonacci numbers allowed the tabla player to work out all the different rhythms that could be made with long and short beats. And what the tabla player and poets found was that if you want to understand how many rhythms and how to build them and how to grow them as the rhythms get longer and longer, it's these numbers, the Fibonacci numbers. So I found a text by Ramachandra writing about these numbers 100 years before Fibonacci. So I think we need to rename them, and perhaps JLF is the place to start. You know, these should be the Ramachandra numbers, helping us to make rhythms in poetry and in music, and later Fibonacci discovered them.
So, Marcus, let's just wind back 20
Sorry, yeah.
years, because I think you've given the context of primes brilliantly. And I should say, that's the old edition of the book, but there's a brand new 20th anniversary edition with a lovely foreword by Simon McBurney, the director and actor who you've worked with together on a kind of play around Ramanujan. And so when it comes out in a few weeks' time, you must all rush out and buy it, of course. But what's fascinating is the story has moved on since Marcus wrote Music of the Primes 20 years ago. But Marcus, just, at that time, because I am a sort of dinosaur and can remember that bright spot in the sky, and I can remember in the 90s, there weren't really many pop maths books out there. What made you think that you could write this book in the first place and find a really big audience for it as well?
Well, there was a book that was very important, I think, in starting this kind of trend of popular mathematics and science books, which was Simon Singh's book, Fermat's Last Theorem. And I think this, for me, it's suddenly opened up a way of writing about mathematics as a narrative, as a story. I mean, it's a beautiful book, Simon's book. And partly that was another reason why I wrote this book, because in the mid-90s, my colleague in Oxford, Andrew Wiles, proved Fermat's Last Theorem. This was this 350-year-old problem about an equation which we believed didn't have any solutions. And we've been on this extraordinary journey, which culminated in Andrew's proof. But I was a little bit worried, because I thought, everyone's going to think, that's the last theorem. They finished maths. It's all over and done with. And so I was quite keen to put back in the public imagination, actually, there are loads of unsolved problems, and actually a really fundamental one, which is about the most basic things in our subject, which are these prime numbers. So for me, the motivation, in part, was wanting to put something back in the public imagination as the greatest, and it was always actually more important than Fermat's Last Theorem. Fermat's Last Theorem, the fact that this equation hasn't got any solutions, really hasn't had any implications. But if we understand these prime numbers, it's going to open up so much important discoveries about numbers and therefore mathematics. Many of us have kind of theorems waiting. If the primes behave like this, then I can prove the such and such. I have several papers which start with, I think the primes behave like this. We don't know. But if they do, I can prove this. And actually, it was mentioned in the introduction, you said about them being important to cryptography. Yeah. Every time you go on Amazon and you buy, Roger's new book.
We've got a Nobel Prize winner in the audience, Marcus.
Yes,
you better up your game a bit now.
Every time you use your credit card and you send it to a bookshop online, you're actually using prime numbers to keep that credit card secret. You're actually using the fact that we don't understand primes well enough. It's the key to these codes. If we understand primes and sort of solve the mystery at the heart of this book, it could well be that all those codes on the internet will suddenly become insecure. So there are many more implications of this theorem. But I must say, when I told my colleagues, I've got this great idea, I'm going to write about our greatest unsolved problem, which is something called the Riemann hypothesis. My colleagues were, you've got to be mad. That's the most difficult challenge in mathematics. Even our undergraduates don't understand what this theorem is.
But of course,
that was the challenge.
But also, people forget that maths is done by people. And actually, I can remember I was one of the horde of journalists trying to get hold of Andrew Wiles, who wouldn't talk to anyone. He did talk to Simon Singh, and Simon was working on a horizon. And strangely enough, I can remember encouraging him at the time, you've got a book in this. And what I didn't really realize from that particular story was that, yes, cracking Fermat's Last Theorem might not have some obvious application, but it's an incredibly romantic story of struggle and setbacks. There's an extraordinary moment when actually his first stab at it was wrong, and that's usually fatal, but they managed to fix it, didn't they? Which is almost miraculous when you look back at it.
I think this point about the people is really important, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history of writing this book, because when I first wrote my first draft and gave it to my editor, who was a historian, he said, this is unreadable. He says, all the stories are topsy-turvy in kind of like the wrong order. I don't understand what you're trying to say. But for me, I'd written it with a scientific narrative. It made perfect sense to me as a scientist. It was the story unfolding about these prime numbers. And he said, that's not your audience. You're not writing for your fellow scientists. You're writing for people who are frightened a little bit of mathematics and science, and you need to find a different way. And so I went away from that in tears, actually, from that first meeting, because it was galling to have spent so many years writing this thing and then to have it ripped apart in front of me. But
I've got to say, having had a lot of editors over the years, a tough editor is a good editor.
no,
I
exactly. So actually, when I told this story to colleagues, they said, you are very lucky to have an editor who wants to spend the time to teach you how to write. And he did. I mean, I had wonderful people like Roger who helped me to learn how to write an article for the newspaper. It's a very different thing writing a book. In fact, my editor said, you're writing like a journalist. Every page is shouting and calm down. People are in it for the long haul. They're in it for the long haul. They will be with you. You don't have to make them turn every page, which was quite a relief, actually. But then I learned that what people enjoy is a historical narrative. They understand that. And for me, it then allowed me to bring the people to life. And this is really a book full of wonderful characters. And many people have said, the maths, I like that, but the way you tell the story about all of these characters, and it's a little bit like a kind of relay race. Science is a bit like that. We make some discoveries, we pass the baton on to the next generation. They run a little bit further. But the greatest compliment people have paid me about this book is they said, this read like a murder mystery. I read it like a novel. You just like, but this is a murder mystery where you don't find out who did it. In the end, we still don't know the secret to these numbers. There's still a big mystery.
But some interesting progress has been made, hasn't it? I don't know. I mean, before we get to where we are now compared with the book, because we've had a Fields Medal and all sorts of things, although we're still not quite there. Were you working on the Riemann hypothesis at the time? Were you in that field, or did you dare do that dangerous thing, which is to not write about your own expertise?
Actually, this was very much at the heart of what I do as a research mathematician, because the tool that we eventually understood in the 19th century, which was the one which unlocked kind of some of the secrets of these numbers, is something called a zeta function. And this is actually a tool I use to understand the world of symmetry. So for me, often people think, if a scientist is actually writing for the public, it's a very one-way process. But this was not a one-way process at all. I learned so much about my subject I didn't appreciate, partly because history is wiped out of most of education in science, especially in sciences where you overturn theories. There's really no point in learning a theory that's 200 years old. In mathematics, it's actually more important because it isn't a kind of survival of the fittest theory like in science. In mathematics, there's a slightly different character to it because the breakthroughs that the ancient Greeks made 2,000 years ago are as true today as they were when they were proved 2,000 years ago. And so we're building on everything the previous generations have done. And that's why actually history is very important to understanding the breakthroughs mathematicians made and why history was actually a really good vehicle to kind of tell this story.
So the book was really quite a magic key for you in terms of understanding how to popularize mathematics.
But also understanding my own subject. I mean, this is the beauty. You sort of think it's one way, but I learned, and my fellow mathematicians said I didn't understand why this was our greatest unsolved problem. And kind of the feedback I got from my fellow mathematicians was as valuable as people from the public, because they were the ones I was frightened about. This was my first kind of putting my head above the parapet. And
I was going to say, because I think although things have changed, they're still not perfect, and there's still, dare I say it, quite a lot of jealousy. If you're a scientist and popularizer, your peers kind of hate your guts because you've got a higher profile than them. And it used to be, it could get quite unpleasant a couple of decades ago. It's much better now, but it's still not gone, I don't think.
One of the books that really inspired me to become a mathematician when I was a kid was a book called A Mathematician's Apology by G.H. Hardy. And I really recommend this book because it it sort of explains what it means to be a sort of a mathematician from a creative point of view. Actually, you're going to hear about creativity and science in the next session. And creativity for me is a very important word in doing mathematics. But this book starts with the opening statement. It is a melancholy experience for a professional mathematician to find himself writing about mathematics. The job of a mathematician is to prove theorems, not to talk about them. So actually he was a counterexample to his own statement, because he was a great popularizer as well as being a great mathematician. But I lived under the spectre of this statement, as did many mathematicians. And I must credit the Royal Society with actually, I became, before I was a fellow of the Royal Society, which is the greatest honor I've ever received in my life. For me, that's the thing I value most. OBEs I can give away, but the FRS is. But I was a risk. Are
you saying that the honours system has come into disrepute in
slightly
some way?
in the last
Surely
few
not.
days, especially. But I was also I was a research fellow of the Royal Society, and at that time I was starting to experiment a little bit. That was meant to be a job to help you to do your research, but I was starting to experiment with a few articles with journalists like yourself, and I got support from the Royal Society. And I was nervous, but they said no. It was a really turning point around 2000 when the Royal Society realized we've got all of these scare stories coming up about science, and the scientists aren't talking about it. Yeah. And we're letting the kind of journalists who don't understand the science drive the story. And we need scientists to step up to the plate and actually engage with the stories and help people to understand what is a genetically modified crop. What is stem cell research? You can't have a debate if you don't understand that. So the Royal Society were very supportive of my first moves. And as you say, the climate changed about 20 years ago with the Jenkins report in the House of Lords saying this is part of a scientist's job. This is, you do your research.
After all, they're often getting taxpayer money, so
yes.
It's right. They've got to explain to the taxpayer how that money is spent.
Exactly. This is, I mean, I had this debate with politicians and journalists when I was at All Souls as a fellow, and they said, look, it's part of your job. You get paid by us. We need to know what you're doing. So actually, I got quite a lot of support from very important people, which I think was really important in my journey to carry on doing this, because I did get a lot of snide kind of feedback as well. Oh, you've sold out and things like this. In fact, I had an agent came to me when he started seeing me writing these articles for the newspaper and said, have you got a book in you? And I said, I think there's a book. I think there's a book about this unsolved problem, but I can't write it yet because I'll just get shot down by all my fellow. Look, I've got to write all of these articles for a journal, so I published a big article in the Annals of Mathematics, which is where Andrew published his proof of our Fermat's theorem. I wanted to get out a really good body of very fundamental science before I took the risk of going over. And firstly, the agent came back after a year and a half and said, okay, have you published all of those papers you mentioned? And I said, yes, they're out there. And I felt ready to take the risk, which it is a risk for a scientist to kind of put your head above the parapet. But it's an important risk, and even more so in this age of science being such a big superpower that's kind of having such a big impact across society.
And the age of fake news, where we need mathematical truths more than ever before.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it is an important role of the scientists, and the Royal Society was very supportive in that.
Well, I'm hoping that we'll get some questions from the audience in maybe 10 or 15 minutes or something. But let's just try to give me a sense of what the state of understanding. We were looking for patterns in the primes, weren't we, at the end of the day? And how far have we got? And I should say, if you solve this problem, you will win $1 million, I seem to remember.
I would pay $1 million to solve this problem. The kind of, just the glory and the honor and the fact your name will live on forever as the person who solved this problem, $1 million is nothing in comparison to that. So, but yeah, it's kind of a cute thing that there is $1 million prize which is offered in the year 2000. But actually, we are now at the point where we believe there are no patterns in the primes. And that's actually harder to prove that there are no patterns than to find a pattern. In fact, it was one of the reasons Fermat's last theorem was such a challenge. You've got to prove there are no solutions, no numbers, however far big you go, that will solve this equation. Those kind of challenges are more difficult. And showing that something doesn't have a pattern is a kind of, how do you even go about that? But the great breakthrough was Bernhard Riemann, this German mathematician in the middle of the 19th century, found a way to articulate what having no pattern meant. And that's now what we're trying to prove. It's something called the Riemann hypothesis. And so,
but of course, even if they're random, you would expect bunching of primes and so on, and which is interesting in itself.
Very nice. So you've just teed up for what's happened in the last 20 years. Because one of the reasons I wanted to do an anniversary edition was, of course, things have happened in the last 20 years, and this book now needed updating. So I've written a new chapter, which will be in the new edition, about the things which have happened. And what we've discovered is not about the Riemann hypothesis, but about something about the gaps between primes as you climb higher and higher. Now, we know the primes get rarer and rarer, but we think something rather strange happens. Just as you're waiting for the number 73 bus up in Stoke Newington, and you're waiting and it's just not coming, and then suddenly 3 come along together. Primes are just like that. So you can be having these incredibly, barren period of numbers, and then suddenly you'll get 2 popping up one after the other. So these are very important primes. They're called twin primes. So, for example, 17 and 19. It's the closest 2 can be because the one in the middle is 18 and it's even. 41 and 43. Another example where they come. So the primes get rarer and rarer, but we believe, and it's something called the twin primes conjecture, that infinitely often you'll see these little pairs of primes coming like the number 73 bus, no primes, and then suddenly 2 coming along together. Now, I must tell you a little secret. I have 2 twin daughters. And when we got them, they're adopted. When we got them, I was very keen to name them 41 and 43 because they are twin. Well,
I have a feeling your wife might have had something.
So my
to say
wife
about
said, over my dead body, they call 41. So they're now called Magali and Ina. But my secret names for them are 41 and 43. So this has been one of the ways, and actually it's an indication of randomness. If this is happening with the primes, this is what random numbers do. They have big gaps and then they bunch. So if we could prove that infinitely often we saw this bunching, it would be a very good indication that the randomness is really genuinely there. So the breakthroughs that have happened, which I talk about in this new chapter, are that we now understand that they do kind of bunch together, but not as tightly as 2 apart. So the first great breakthrough was this Chinese mathematician, Zhang, who, out of nowhere, I mean, this is a lovely thing about mathematics. You can suddenly have somebody appear from absolutely nowhere, and if they prove something and the details are there, it doesn't matter that they don't have the metadata of Harvard or Oxford. If the mathematics speaks for itself. That's one of the reasons I loved it. I'm actually quite a shy person, despite when I go on stage, it's sort of other things happen. But I don't want to spend my time kind of promoting my theory and things like that. I want the mathematics to speak for itself. And with this guy, Zhang, we didn't know who he was.
But of course, you say, oh, someone's got it right. But that's a non-trivial thing. I mean, for example, when Wiles unveiled his proof, I seem to remember the joke was it was a proof by intimidation because it was like 100 pages. And it took ages for the mathematical community to go through it and check it. And so it's not straightforward, is it?
The interesting thing about Zhang's paper when he submitted it was people saw very quickly that it was right, and he got it accepted within a month, and it was being talked about. Now, he hadn't proved the twin primes conjecture, which is that infinitely often you see these things 2 apart. What it proved was infinitely often you'll see 2 primes which are 70 million apart. You might say, well, that's what a rubbish theorem, But actually, that's significant because as you go higher and higher, the primes get so rare that you'll see just huge billions of numbers without primes. So actually, in a way, you can think about the twin primes conjecture is that what we believe is if you have a window where you can see 3 numbers, that infinitely often you'll suddenly see 2 primes in that little window. Going across 17 and 19, there it is, 41 and 43. So we believe this little window of 3 numbers, you'll see infinitely often 2 primes in there. So what Zhang had proved is that, okay, we can't do that smaller window, but if we take 70 million numbers, if you move that little window along, then infinitely often 2 primes will pop up in that window. Now that is a significant thing because infinity is much bigger than 70 million. 70 million is a tiny little number for us mathematicians who live in the infinite world. It's almost as small as 2 or 3. 70 million is minute. Anyway, so it was a very significant breakthrough.
I can see smoke coming out the ears of various members of the audience here, but keep it up, Marcus.
But so the exciting thing that's happened over the last few years is we've gradually reduced the size of this window. There was a very interesting project, and it was a new story in mathematics about collaboration. Very often, Andrew sat in his attic for 7 years and wouldn't share his ideas with anybody. Everyone thought he'd dried up, and then he produced his work. We're not very good at collaborating. Yeah. But there's a new project now. Timothy Gowers was the initiator of it. It's a wonderful Fields medalist in Cambridge. Hey, we should use the fact that the internet can connect us all across the world. Why don't we actually share our ideas? What a crazy idea. But it actually revolutionized this problem because we managed to reduce the gap to about 2,000. And they were about to publish this when suddenly this young Oxford mathematician burst onto the scene, James Maynard, who was rewarded with a Fields Medal on this last round, one of our great superstars who finishes this new chapter because he's got suddenly these incredible, wonderful new insights on the primes. And now we've got the gap down to 246.
In fact, we had James Maynard in the museum a few weeks ago talking about this. And there was a kind of very comical, well, first of all, that collaborative element came through because he made the point that when Zhang got to sort of first base, rather than feeling kind of jealous, he actually felt motivated. He was using quite a different method to get the same answer. And he thought, okay, I'm going to keep on going. This has given me a kind of new wind, as it were. But then he said, he found that the people, I can't remember, the Mathematical Institute that gives the Fields medals out had been trying to ring him, and he kept on sort of thinking, well, it's probably a boring old committee or something like that. I mustn't get too excited about it. And then in the Zoom call, they said, do you want the Fields medal? And famously, a few years ago, a Russian mathematician had rejected it. Now, remember, we're talking about a mathematician here, so they're not like normal people, okay? So what went through James's mind? It was kind of, I must make sure that they don't think I'm rejecting the Fields medal, so I'm going to talk to them very, very slowly, so there's no ambiguity that I have won the Fields medal. And he did win the Fields medal, but it's kind of, isn't that interesting and strange and rather exotic and wonderful?
Well, it is, but it does go back to this story of, which actually relates a little bit to this statement that I said I would actually pay $1 million to prove the Riemann hypothesis. So Grigory Perelman, this Russian mathematician, who was offered the Fields medal, offered $1 million because it was another of these prize problems. We have 7 prize problems, including the one about the primes, which have $1 million tag to them. He turned that down as well. And I think part of the reason he did that is, for me, proving this great unsolved problem, the Poincare conjecture, which is about the geometry of the possible shapes of our universe, essentially. That was so much bigger a prize than all of these other little things like a Fields medal. And so I think we were shocked because, to win a Fields medal is, it's almost like becoming a fellow of the Royal Society. It's the Nobel Prize.
I think it's rarer than a Nobel Prize. Was it 4 Fields medalists every 4 years?
Yeah, one a year.
Yeah, so there's not many Fields medalists around. You've got to be under the age of 40 as well.
Yes, and this is another interesting thing because you have to be under the age of 40, not because we've done our best work by the age of 40 and you're all washed up, so who's going to win one? But actually, when Fields set this up, and it's the Fields Institute in Toronto that's responsible partly for giving these, and the IMU, the International Mathematical Union. He set them up because he wanted these to be prizes to stimulate further great discoveries. The Nobel Prizes generally get, offered at people at the end of people's careers.
Sorry,
when they've done all their best work. So Fields wanted it to be an encouragement for people still under 40 to, gosh, I've dug myself a grave. That's so sorry.
It's a good thing you got your FRS already in the bag, actually.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and for James Maynard, who's won the Fields medal, actually, he's still in his early 30s. He could win it again. I'm sure he will go on to discover more interesting, more crazy things. And in fact, I talk in the book about some other wonderful discoveries, including this very strange fact that there are infinitely many prime numbers which don't have the number 7 in them. Now, that's kind of curious. Okay, if you look at the beginning, quite a lot don't have 7. You know, they've got 13, 23, 29. But actually, when you get up to numbers with 1 billion digits, you know, or let's say 10 billion digits, you'll expect 1 billion of them to be 7s. Because, you know, there's random digits. So to be able to prove that actually there are no 7s in there is an extraordinary fact about prime numbers, that there are infinitely many, which, you know, should have 1 in 10 numbers be a 7, and there are no 7s.
And I seem to remember that's something that James Maynard
James proved this. It's one of the discoveries that I put in the book, which I think is just such a crazy discovery that he made about primes, which is kind of weird.
So, Marcus, finally, and look, then I must get some questions from the audience. I mean, where are we with cracking the Riemann hypothesis and you getting that $1 million?
I think we've made some extraordinary discoveries in the last 20 years. That's why I felt it was the right moment to add a chapter and do this anniversary edition. But I do feel we're like one big idea away from proving that theorem. And interesting, it was mentioned that I've written 2 plays. My most recent play is a play I'm hoping to take to India, actually. So if anybody knows anybody who'd like to fund a play, I've already got a producer in Mumbai. But it's about a mathematician who proved something like the Riemann hypothesis whilst in jail in France, awaiting trial. And his great breakthrough it was the Riemann hypothesis not for primes, but for equations, like the ones that Andrew Wiles worked on. And we think that the breakthrough he made in prison, which is what the play is partly about, is actually the key to proving the Riemann hypothesis. So we're sort of trying to replicate the ideas that happened in this French prison that André Weil made this great breakthrough on. And
are there lots of mathematicians sitting in prisons as we speak, just to try to get the atmosphere and the...
It's interesting because...
no distractions.
The reason I'm bringing it to India is that André Weil spent a long time in India before he came back to France, and he got very influenced by the Bhagavad Gita and the ideas of the Indian philosophy. He learned Sanskrit, and there was an Indian mathematician who used to say, look, if I could spend 6 months in prison, I'd be able to prove the Riemann hypothesis. And suddenly, André Weil was given this opportunity, partly because he didn't want to fight, and he got put in prison for actually not turning up for duty. And the play is called The Axiom of Choice. It's about free will, because he then gets given a choice about the sentence that the judge says. You've got 2 choices. 1, you can either spend another 5 years in jail, or 2, you can serve in a combat unit. This is the beginning of the Second World War. And so the play is investigating, why did he make the choice he did? Because he didn't, I'm going to spoil it now, but he didn't choose to stay in prison. You think, having proved this wonderful, he'd spend another 5 years and prove the Riemann hypothesis. He went to serve in a combat unit. So it's a very strange choice, especially because he'd been infected. He met Gandhi and was very influenced by the ideas of, non-violent demonstration. Yet he made this decision. And it saved his life, because 2 days after he left the prison, the Nazis invaded France, and the prison warder of the prison, in order to make a fast escape, murdered all the prisoners that were in the prison. And André Weil would not have survived. He went on to go to Princeton, to the Institute for Advanced Study, lived to a very grand old age, proving many great things. But that decision he made, which I still don't understand, why didn't he stay in prison? Why did he take that risk? So the play is sort of investigating, and his time in India, I think, is very important to understanding that journey.
Well, I think it's a challenge for JLF in Jaipur to stage this play. Sanjoy, there we are. He's nodding. Challenge accepted here.
Oh, great.
Let's have a couple of questions from the audience. Fire away.
Hi. Thank you for that. That was brilliant. I was just wondering, when you were talking about numbers with 1 million digits not having a 7, how do you work with numbers that are that long that presumably the mathematicians themselves don't actually know what the number is, because you can't even comprehend that number of digits, so the numbers that you're working with, you yourself don't know what they are, which just sounds bizarre to think about.
Yeah, this is one of the challenges. See, I'm actually rubbish at numbers. You know, as a mathematician, I go on radio shows and they say, do 1,026 times 423. And I'm like, I can't even do like 8 times 6. It's like, I can't, yeah. So actually, you're absolutely right. We do not care about the numbers individually. And this is why I call this the music of the primes, because what we care about is how these numbers are put together in this big kind of piece of music. So I feel like the numbers themselves, individual numbers, like individual notes. And just hearing a musician go, "Loo," it's not interesting. What's interesting is how they get put together. And so we will not be interested in the individual numbers. We'll be interested in just how they get glued together. And this thing, the zeta function, is the key often to finding structure where at first sight there just seem to be these individual notes. And you try and find these ways. And often it's about, weirdly, translating the numbers into language. And a language that we develop. So we are sort of trying to make new languages to be able to talk about these very elusive characters. And that is often why I think actually mathematicians are at heart storytellers, and why, you know, I love the fact that JLF has always believed that scientists are an important component of our culture and need to be here at JLF talking about our stories. And so that's, in a way, you know, we don't care about these individual, we care about the language which will reveal the stories behind the numbers.
Let's have a question from one of my former Daily Telegraph colleagues here.
Thank you. Apologies for all the trouble I've given you over the years. We won't go into that. Could you say something about your first play and where Ramanujan fits into all this?
Well, interestingly, my first play grew out of the play that I did about Ramanujan, which was with Simon McBurney, which is one of the reasons I asked him whether he'd be up for writing the foreword to this new book, because he invited me. He read my book, and there's a lot about Ramanujan in this book, because Ramanujan's introduction to Hardy in Cambridge is a letter that he writes about the discoveries he's made about prime numbers. And so when Simon read my chapters about Ramanujan, he invited me into the rehearsal room to help the actors to understand the mathematics. Now, what he didn't know was he's created this wonderful company, Complicity. My other passion, as well as mathematics and football, is theatre. And I'd worked with a theatre company in Oxford called the Pegasus Theatre, a community theatre. And in the early days of Complicity, they used to come through the theatre and do workshops for us. And I'd fallen in love with this theatre company. And when my maths was going badly, I would dream about running away with this theatre company. So when I got this letter from Simon saying, "You probably don't know who we are, we're a theatre company, we're thinking of doing a play about Ramanujan and primes," I wrote with the most ridiculous fanboy letter that anyone's. I know exactly who you are. I've been fantasizing about running away with you. And so I came into the rehearsal room, and usually the idea is they bring an academic in for an afternoon. But because I understood about theatre, I made all these theatre games explaining the primes and how they work and how there are infinitely many of them. And so Simon, at the end of the day, said, "Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" And I said, "Yeah, I would love to come tomorrow." So and every evening he would go, "Are you free tomorrow?" And I would come. So I spent about several months with him, and at which point a producer came over and said, "When Simon says, 'Are you free tomorrow?' you say no, because he's getting so obsessed with the mathematics, he's not writing the play. And he needs to write this play because we're on at the Barbican in a month's time. So don't come back tomorrow." So eventually I didn't come back, and they did this wonderful play, A Disappearing Number, which was on at the Barbican, and opens with a proof of the analytic continuation of the zeta function of primes. And the audience sit there going, "Oh my gosh, what have I stepped into?" But it's a wonderful kind of moment to take you into the world of this mathematician. Saskia Reeves plays a modern-day mathematician working on the primes. And so I was very lucky to have that opportunity to work with Simon. And out of that grew my first play, which I wrote in collaboration with an actress that I met on that project. And it's called I Is a Strange Loop. It's actually about consciousness, AI, theatre, mathematics, and was inspired actually by a Borges short story that I read called The Library of Babel.
Marcus, I must just, before we take another audience question, Ramanujan is such a fascinating character, and just because he intuited the proofs without going through the classical methods that the likes of Hardy. Just explain, a little bit about his little black book and why that's such an extraordinary document.
Well, I think sometimes it gets over-egged how much Ramanujan was sort of untaught, a clerk in Madras, came from nowhere. He didn't come from nowhere. He came from quite a tradition, a Brahmin tradition of mathematics being important. So I think we shouldn't over-egg this idea of just as somebody from nowhere. But there's an important thing, and it's actually an interesting thing about Indian mathematics. The way that it was written was very often in poetry form, and they would not give the explanations, and it would be, the idea would be enough to show the breakthrough, and that would be enough. So one of the things that Ramanujan had to learn when he came to Cambridge was he had all of these incredible insights, and he used to talk about Namagiri, his family god, giving him these insights, which, his way of expressing that kind of amazing moment we have as mathematicians, when you suddenly see what's going on, you know where it's come from. That's the beauty of creativity. It's sort of quite elusive thing to pin down. And but what Hardy tried to help him with was actually articulating the steps to get to those breakthroughs.
Still one of the great amazing stories. We've got, I think, a question over here. Oh, actually, this chap's so enthusiastic, I think he wins, and then you next, actually. I'm using Darwinian principles here.
Oh, thanks. I don't regard myself as a mathematician. I'm also much worse at arithmetic than you are. However, I am a maths teacher, and I'm not happy with your definition of primes, I'm afraid.
Ooh.
Very good. I'm up for this.
Okay, okay.
No.
While you were talking, I decided to compose my own definition of primes. You said they're indivisible. Now, that divisible is definitely part of my definition. Just a second. Here we go. A prime number is divisible only by two different numbers, one and itself.
Okay. Now, this is what your maths teachers tell you at school. It is correct, but it misses the point. So the point here, now I'll tell you what the point here is 1 a prime number? No. Okay, why? Okay, why is 1 not a prime number? In this definition, it's because it's not got two divisors, but that's not the real reason. What did I also add? I said they are the building blocks, the atoms which you build all other numbers from. And that's the key reason why 1, although indivisible, is not a building block. Because when you multiply by 1, you get nothing new. And so it's a bit like the vacuum. So when I go into schools, I say, ignore what your teachers say. It's the wrong... It is a... Okay, it's technically a correct definition, but it's not the reason we excluded 1 because it's not got 2 prime factors. We excluded 1. And interestingly, when Gauss was writing about primes in the middle or the beginning of the 19th century, he thought that 1 was a prime. His list of primes, which I've seen in his diary in Göttingen, he writes 1, 2, 3, 5, 7. But as we began to realize the important thing is of these as building blocks, we threw 1 away and realized that although it's indivisible, it's not something, it shouldn't be on that periodic table. We don't put the vacuum as the beginning of the story. So that's, so thank you, that was really wonderful. I enjoyed that.
You're still smiling, which is great, actually. Let's have another, now, this gentleman over here with the hat has patiently waited. I'm sorry, you were further away from the microphone. That's the real reason I did it.
I'm not sure I need the microphone. I've been told by Willie Dalrymple in the Piggott Theatre that my voice is so loud, don't give him the microphone. Anyway, my question is this. So there is a lot of heat and light right now about AI, generative AI, doing amazing things, including, I believe, passing the Chartered Financial Analyst exam, the New York Bar exam, and some other things. Those, possibly that just proves that those exams are dumb, and actually AI is not very smart. My personal view is that AI is not that smart yet. So my question to you as a mathematician is, can ChatGPT, or perhaps its grandchild, do theoretical maths? proof.
Okay, yes.
Could it solve the Riemann hypothesis?
Yes, exactly. The Riemann hypothesis. Riemann is a stationist. Sorry. Yes, now, I've got a couple of books, not the music of the primes, I think, but I've got, one is my most recent book, which is Thinking Better, which actually talks about shortcuts and ways of thinking. But the other one is called The Creativity Code, and it's about, can AI be creative? And since I said mathematics is about being creative, can AI actually produce new things that surprise us rather than just kind of pastiches? And that book explains, yes, there is a possibility of new things to emerge. Now, one of the big, it's a lot about the creative arts, music, literature, visual arts, but one of the big streams in that book is about mathematics because, a lot of people say, well, surely you're going to be the first to be put out of a job because, what is AI? AI is code, which is algorithms, and algorithms is just maths, so it's doing maths whenever it's doing anything. But what we've discovered is that actually it's very hard for AI to tell really good stories. So all the novelists here are safe. What ChatGPT is good at is locally generating pretty consistent text, and it can be, but it's not good in the kind of long form writing. So it starts to lose the plots, often quite literally. If you ask it to kind of tell a murder mystery and you give it some seeds, okay, this is going to, or like a spy novel, this person is going to turn out to be a double agent. You don't want that being told. It tells it in chapter 1. It just doesn't understand a sense of the temporal. Now, this I think is important because, as I said, a mathematician is a storyteller. The proofs that we create are stories and require quite extended, connected narratives about how a character is changing, mutating. And so I think that's one of the limitations that ChatGPT combined with some other tools is already proving sort of short-term 1-hour problems, but it isn't proving 350-year-old problems or like the Riemann hypothesis. However, there is a role for AI in the world of mathematics, and it's a very interesting one. Because what AI is very good at doing is if you give it a huge data set, it can look inside that data and spot patterns that we as humans with our embodiment and our limitations cannot. So for me, AI, and I often compare AI a bit like that moment when Galileo got a telescope. And that telescope allowed him to see deep into the solar system in a way, and we saw things we'd never seen before. And this tool of AI is allowing us to look into the digital universe and see patterns that have eluded us. And so there's one of the great breakthroughs a couple of years ago. It was published in Nature in the end December 2021, was a collaboration between a colleague of mine in Oxford and DeepMind, who are just up there, the great AI developers. They're doing some great fundamental science, protein folding, for example. Yep. But they got this AI to look at the data set in my kind of area of symmetry. And this AI spotted some patterns. If you change this other thing seems to change in a weird, related way. And so the AI made a new conjecture. We'd never seen this pattern before. But it couldn't prove why it was true, and it might have just been a kind of elusive, shadowy thing which would disappear. But my colleague in Oxford said, I never spotted this before. And it stimulated him to actually produce a proof of why there is a connection between these two things. So my great belief, and it's the message of that book, is that this is an exciting new period for creative artists and scientists, that we have a new collaborator that we can work with, which is artificial intelligence. And we shouldn't be frightened that it's going to wipe us out and that JLF in another 10 years' time will just be a load of bots on stage interviewing each other about their novels.
No one can replace you, Marcus. Don't worry.
That actually this is a collaboration. So we might see an author with ChatGPT or GPT-27 on stage talking about their collaboration. That would be an interesting potential.
But of course,
future.
if you play with ChatGPT, it does produce a load of old rubbish. It's very plausible. It kind of reminds me of dealing with a politician. You think, oh, yeah, that's right. And then you think, hang on, the whole of the scientific world using imperial units, as one politician likes to say, that's completely nuts. And it's
a very good idea, because decimal is rubbish. It's only divisible by 2 primes, 2 and 5, whilst imperial was much cleverer. You got kind of like base 24, 60, 12. No, I'm with Boris Johnson on going imperial.
And Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg as well. But anyway, now let's have one last question. You've been a brilliant audience. There must be one here. Oh, let's hang on for the microphone.
Thank you so much. That was so brilliant. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about symmetry. You've mentioned it very briefly.
So the book I wrote after this was actually, so this is about prime numbers, which is kind of the key to understanding part of my work, but the other part of my work is creating new symmetries that nobody's ever discovered. And so my second book is actually about symmetry. So I really recommend you also get a copy of that. But for me, symmetry, I understood, actually, when I was at school, I wanted to be a linguist. Because my mum had been in the Foreign Office, and I thought she'd been a spy. I thought she was basically 0017 or something. And so when I went up to school, I started trying to learn languages, but I'm rubbish. I've got a very bad memory, so just can't. And then my maths teacher showed me that actually mathematics is a language. It's the language to understand nature. And the one language I really fell in love with, it was this language of symmetry. Because symmetry is actually underpinning nearly everything that's significant in science and nature. And so for me, learning this language of symmetry was actually my access to understanding a lot about the way our universe works. So for me, symmetry is is nature's language, which shows why things are significant. You know, we're very sensitive to symmetry because if we were in the jungle and there was just a chaos of the jungle, if suddenly there was something symmetrical, that was probably an animal, and either it was going to eat you or you could eat it. So that's one. You know, we've got Blake, the wonderful statue out here. That's why tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. What eternal mound or I framed thy fearful symmetry. And what he's expressing there is, the tiger, it's symmetrical, and we were sensitive to that symmetry, and it's what helped us to survive. So we were all kind of reading this language because evolutionary-wise, it's what helped us to navigate our way through the universe. So this language is actually one that our brain is very sensitive to.
I seem to remember you named a symmetry group after me.
I did, actually. So I discovered all of these new symmetries which live in very high-dimensional space. I can't make them for you to see, but I did this project which was raising money for a charity I support, an education charity I support in Guatemala. My 2 girls are adopted from Guatemala, and I wanted to adopt all of these children, and I couldn't. So I now help fund a charity which helps get kids off the street and into education. And I funded this by, I got all these symmetrical objects, and they were not named. So I allowed people to name a symmetry in hyperspace in exchange for a donation to the charity. And I raised $30,000 naming these, including one named after you, Roger.
Well, I think that's a beautiful human place to stop. And it shows you, mathematicians are people, and it's a creative enterprise. We've had such a vivid insight into the way that maths works today. I just want to say thank you so much to the JLF for hosting us. Happy 10th anniversary, JLF London, and thank you to William and
I prefer the 11th. That's a prime number. But,
sorry.
I'll be back next year.
Next year's the year to aim for. Finally, do give Marcus a big hand of applause. Thank you.